They told us the Tiger was invincible. 131 tons of Krupp steel, an 88-millimeter gun that could punch through a Sherman from 1,000 meters, armor thick enough to shrug off anything the Allies could throw at it. They told us a lot of things in 1944. Most of them were lies. My name is Klaus Zimmerman. I was 22 years old when I became the driver of Tiger 231, part of Schwere Panzerabteilung 503. And I'm 79 now, sitting in a cafe in Munich where young people drink coffee that costs more than my weekly ration used to. And I'm telling you this story because someone needs to remember what actually happened. Someone needs to remember Greta Hoffmann and a screw that cost 50 pfennigs. September 1944. The Eastern Front had become a bleeding wound that wouldn't close. We'd been pushed back from Kursk, back from Ukraine, back from everything we'd taken. The great offensive had become a great retreat, and every day the noose tightened a little more. Our division was stationed near the Vistula River, part of the defensive line that was supposed to hold back the Soviet advance into Poland. Supposed to. The Tigers were supposed to save us. These massive beasts, each one worth 100 men in combat power, except they kept breaking down. The Maybach HL-230 engine was a masterpiece of German engineering and also a mechanical nightmare. It overheated, it consumed fuel like a drunkard consumes vodka, and worst of all, it was slow. Not slow in combat, you understand. The Tiger could do 38 kilometers per hour on a good road, which was fast enough to position and maneuver, but slow to respond. There was this delay in the transmission system, a half-second lag between when you pushed the lever and when the tank actually shifted gears. Half a second doesn't sound like much until you're trying to reverse out of an ambush and a T-34 is lining up a shot at your thinner rear armor. I learned to anticipate it. Every Tiger driver did. You developed an instinct, a feel for when to shift before you actually needed to, compensating for that delay. It was like dancing with a partner who was always slightly behind the music. You could work with it, but you never stopped noticing it. Our company had 16 Tigers that September. By the third week of the month, we were down to 9 operational. Not from combat losses, though we'd lost men, from mechanical failures, transmission problems, engine problems, track problems. The Tiger was a beast, but it was a fragile beast, and we were running out of spare parts, running out of fuel, running out of time. The crew of Tiger 231 had been together since July. There was Lieutenant Vogel, our commander, a thin man from Dusseldorf who taught mathematics before the war and approached tank combat like it was a geometry problem. Unteroffizier Werner Schaffer, our gunner, who could put an 88-millimeter shell through a T-34's turret ring at 1,200 meters and had done it 17 times. Gefreiter Otto Becker, our loader, who was 19 years old and still got letters from his mother every week, letters that smelled like home and made us all homesick. And Hauptfeldwebel Ernst Muller, our crew chief and radio man, who'd been fixing machines since before any of us were born. We'd fought together through the summer retreat, watched our friends die in burning tanks, pulled back from position after position, trading ground for time, time for survival. We'd become a family, the way soldiers do when every day might be their last together. We knew each other's habits, fears, weaknesses. Otto still flinched at the sound of incoming artillery. Werner muttered prayers in Latin before every engagement. Vogel would tap his left boot 3 times before giving the order to fire, every single time, like a ritual that kept us alive. And Muller could fix anything. I'd seen him repair a transmission with parts from a wrecked Panzer IV and 2 bolts he'd carved from a fence post. I'd seen him get an engine running with no spare parts and nothing but intuition and 40 years of experience. If Muller said something was broken, it was broken. If he said he could fix it, he would. The factory was in Poznan, about 40 kilometers behind our lines. A civilian workshop that had been converted to military production, staffed mostly by Polish workers under German supervision and a handful of German civilians deemed essential to the war effort. I'd never been there. Tankers didn't interact much with the people who built and fixed our machines. We just drove them until they broke, and then the mechanics did their best with whatever parts they could scrounge. But on September 18th, our Tiger threw a track during a repositioning. Simple mechanical failure, the kind that happened weekly. Our crew chief, Hauptfeldwebel Ernst Muller, a man who'd been fixing tanks since before I was born, managed to get us limped back to the repair depot. While they worked on the track, he started poking around the transmission. "Zimmerman," he called to me. I was sitting on the hull, smoking a cigarette and trying not to think about the Soviet artillery we'd heard that morning, closer than it had been the day before. "Come look at this." I climbed down. Muller had the transmission inspection plate open, his hands black with grease. He pointed at a small component, a linkage mechanism that connected the gear selector to the actual transmission gears. "See this assembly? This is what's causing the delay. There's slack in the system, right here." He wiggled a metal arm, and I could see it move maybe 2 millimeters before engaging. "Every Tiger has it, design flaw. The tolerances are too loose." "Can you fix it?" I asked. He shook his head. "Not with standard parts. I'd need custom components, tighter tolerances, better materials. And I'd need permission from Oberkommando, which means paperwork, which means 6 months if we're lucky." He spat into the dirt. "We'll all be dead or in Soviet prison camps by then." That was that, I thought. Just another broken piece of a broken army in a broken army. But Muller kept thinking about it. That night, while the rest of us tried to sleep in our tents, listening to the distant rumble of artillery, he was hunched over a schematic by lamplight, measuring components with calipers, scribbling calculations. I watched him work. The lamplight cast deep shadows on his face, making him look older than his 53 years. His hands, scarred and calloused from decades of metalwork, moved with absolute precision as he measured and calculated. He was muttering to himself in the way he did when he was deep in problem-solving mode, a mix of numbers and curses. "Ernst," I said quietly, "it's after midnight. You should sleep." "Can't sleep," he said without looking up. "I keep thinking about Hartmann." Hartmann had been the driver of Tiger 217. 3 days earlier, his tank had been caught in an ambush. He'd tried to reverse, but the transmission lag meant he was still exposed for that critical half-second, and a Soviet anti-tank gun had put a round through his hull. Hartmann and his gunner had burned to death. We could hear them screaming on the radio. If he'd been able to reverse just a half-second faster— Muller trailed off. He didn't need to finish the sentence. We both knew. "It's not your fault," I said. "I know that." He finally looked up at me, and his eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion. "But I can fix it. I think I can fix it. And if I don't try, and another crew dies because of that goddamn lag—" He shook his head. "I have to try, Klaus." So I sat with him, holding the lamp while he worked through his calculations, until finally he had a solution sketched out on paper. A modified linkage screw with tighter tolerances, hardened steel, a slightly different thread pitch that would eliminate the slack in the system. "Will it work?" I asked. "In theory." He rubbed his eyes. "But the tolerances are tight, very tight. I'd need a skilled machinist, someone who really knows what they're doing, someone with proper equipment." The next morning, he told our company commander, Hauptmann Dietrich, that he wanted to take our Tiger to the factory in Poznan. Not for major repairs, just for what he called precision adjustment. Dietrich was skeptical, but Muller had a reputation. If Muller said something could be improved, you listened. So on September 20th, I drove Tiger 231 to the Poznan factory, Muller beside me, both of us wondering if this was a waste of time we didn't have. The factory was smaller than I'd expected, a converted textile mill, the old machinery pushed to the sides to make room for lathes and milling machines and workbenches. It smelled like cutting oil and metal shavings and something else, something I couldn't quite identify. Desperation, maybe. The kind that comes from trying to build weapons fast enough to stop an army that stretches from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The windows were grimy, letting in gray September light that made everything look washed out and tired. The floor was concrete, stained with oil and scored with the tracks of heavy equipment. Along one wall, racks held partially completed parts. gears, shafts, housings, all in various states of finish. Along another wall, diagrams and technical drawings were pinned to boards, some of them marked with red ink corrections and notes. Most of the workers were Polish men, thin and tired, their hands scarred from metalwork. They barely looked at us. We were just another German tank, another problem to solve, another piece of a war machine that was grinding them under just as surely as it was grinding us. Some of them were young, maybe 16 or 17, boys who should have been in school. Others were older, gray-haired men who moved with the careful deliberation of people whose bodies hurt but who couldn't afford to stop working. There were a few German supervisors, Wehrmacht personnel, who'd been assigned to oversee production. They looked as tired as everyone else. One of them, a Feldwebel with a limp and a missing left hand. She mounted the blank in her lathe and began to cut. The lathe was old, pre-war quality, the kind of machine that had been making textile equipment before it started making tank parts. But in her hands, it sang. That's the only word for it. The cutting tool bit into the steel with a high, clean sound, and curls of metal peeled away in perfect spirals as she shaped the blank into a screw. She worked with absolute precision. Every few minutes, she would stop the lathe, remove the piece, measure it with the micrometer, make a minute adjustment to the cutting depth, and continue. Her face was calm, almost meditative, but her eyes never stopped moving, checking the tool position, the workpiece rotation, the accumulating metal shavings. I'd done some machining before the war. My father had a small workshop, and he taught me the basics. But watching Greta work was like watching a master pianist play. Every movement was economical, precise, purposeful. Her left hand controlled the feed rate with tiny adjustments, her right hand ready to shut down the lathe instantly if anything went wrong. She used her whole body, shifting her weight to get the right viewing angle, leaning in to listen to the sound of the cut. "How long have you been a machinist?" I asked. She didn't look up from her work. 23 years. My father taught me. He had a shop in Stuttgart before the war. And now you're here. Now I'm here. She adjusted the lathe speed, and the cutting sound changed pitch slightly, dropping from a high whine to a deeper hum. My husband was killed in France in 1940. My son was killed at Stalingrad. I'm here because I'm good at making things, and someone has to make the things that keep other people's sons alive a little longer. The way she said it was matter of fact, without self-pity or anger, just stating a fact, like saying the sky was gray or the steel was hard. But I heard the weight behind the words, the years of grief compressed into a single sentence. I didn't know what to say to that. What do you say to a woman who's lost everything but keeps working, keeps making the screws and bolts and parts that feed the machine that killed her family? So I said nothing. I just watched her work. After 2 hours, she had the basic screw shaped. The blank had been transformed into a precise cylinder, the head shaped and chamfered, the shaft turned to exact specifications. She measured it again with the micrometer, checking the diameter at 3 different points along the shaft, verifying that it was perfectly uniform. Then came the threading. This was the critical part, Mueller had explained. The threads had to be perfect, precisely cut, with tolerances measured in hundreds of a millimeter. Too loose and the screw would still allow slack. Too tight and it wouldn't fit at all, or it would bind up and cause new problems. Greta changed the cutting tool, mounting a threading die that looked like it had been custom-made, the cutting edges sharp and precise. She adjusted the lathe to a slower speed and began the delicate work of cutting the helical grooves. This was where her skill really showed. Threading required a steady hand and perfect timing. The cutting tool had to advance at exactly the right rate to match the desired thread pitch, and any variation would ruin the part. She worked even slower now, her eyes fixed on the point where tool met metal, advancing the die a fraction of a turn at a time. Every few passes, she would stop and check the thread pitch with a specialized gauge, a small metal template with precisely cut threads that she would test fit against the screw. Too tight and the gauge wouldn't fit, too loose and it would wobble. She was looking for that perfect fit where the gauge threaded on smoothly but with no play, no slack, no wasted motion. "You're very good at this," I said. "I should be. I've made 10,000 screws in the last year." She pulled the screw from the lathe, examined it under a magnifying glass mounted on an articulated arm, made a tiny adjustment to the threading die, and mounted the screw again. Maybe 15,000. I've stopped counting. She paused, studying the partially threaded screw under the magnifying glass. I could see her eyes moving, checking each thread, looking for imperfections that I couldn't even see. Every screw is different, she continued quietly. Even with the same steel, the same tools, the same measurements. The metal has grain, like wood. It has stresses. It responds differently to the cut depending on temperature, on humidity, on 100 tiny variables. You learn to feel it, to listen to the sound of the cut and know when it's right. Do they all matter this much? She looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something in her eyes that I recognized because I'd seen it in the mirror every morning. The 1,000-yard stare, soldiers called it. The look of someone who'd seen too much and couldn't unsee it. Every screw matters, she said quietly. Every bolt, every washer, every tiny piece. Because somewhere out there, some boy who's scared and far from home is depending on that piece to work correctly. If the screw breaks, maybe his tank breaks down. Maybe he dies. Maybe he lives. I don't know. She turned back to her lathe. But I make every screw like it's the one that will save him. She paused, and for a moment her hand stopped moving. She stood very still, staring at the partially completed screw. My son's name was Michael, she said. He was 21 when he died at Stalingrad. He wrote me letters, told me about the cold, about how the trucks kept breaking down, how the equipment failed in the frost. In his last letter, he told me his rifle had jammed during a Soviet attack. A simple mechanical failure. The firing pin spring broke. Her hands tightened on the lathe controls. I keep thinking about that spring. Someone made it, somewhere. Maybe they were careful, maybe they weren't. Maybe they were tired or rushed or working with bad materials. Maybe it was perfect when it left the factory and it just failed because that's what metal does in -40-degree temperatures. I don't know. She started the lathe again, and the cutting tool bit into the steel. But I make every piece like it's the one that will keep someone's son alive. Because maybe it will. And because I need to believe that the work I do matters, that Michael's death wasn't just random chaos, that somewhere in this war there's still room for craftsmanship, for precision, for doing things right. I understood then. This wasn't just about the screw. It was about maintaining some kind of order, some kind of meaning in a world that had become senseless. Every perfect thread she cut was an act of defiance against the chaos. Every precise measurement was proof that some things could still be done right, even when everything else was falling apart. We didn't talk much after that. I just watched her work, and she focused on the screw with absolute concentration. The threading took another hour. She would cut a few threads, stop, measure, adjust, cut again. The pile of metal shavings on the lathe bed grew slowly. Each curl of steel a tiny fraction removed from the blank, each cut bringing the screw closer to perfection. Finally, she finished the first screw. She removed it from the lathe, cleaned it carefully with a cloth dampened with cutting oil, and examined it under the magnifying glass from every angle. Then she tested it with the thread gauge, threading it on and off several times, feeling for any resistance or play. She nodded, satisfied, and set it aside. Then she selected another blank and started over. "You're making more than one?" I asked. "5, she said. "If this design works, you'll want spares. And if it doesn't work perfectly, I want to iterate, try slight variations, see if I can improve it." She mounted the second blank in the lathe. Good engineering is iterative. You make something, test it, learn from it, make it better. 4 hours later, she had 5 screws. Not 1, 5. Each one precisely identical to the others in dimension, but slightly different in the details. Subtle variations in the thread pitch, the hardness of the steel, the surface finish. Each one tested and measured and perfect in its own way. "These are the basic specifications," she explained, laying out the 5 screws on a clean cloth. "This one has the thread pitch you specified. This one is slightly finer, more threads per centimeter. This one uses a harder steel that will wear better but might be more brittle. This one is smoother finish that will reduce friction. And this one is exactly to your specifications, but made from softer steel that will be more forgiving if the fit isn't perfect. Mueller had come over to see the finished products. He examined each screw with his jeweler's loupe, checking the threading, the diameters, the finish. I watched his face change as he studied them. He was a man who'd worked with machinery for 30 years, and he recognized mastery when he saw it. This is, he paused, searching for words. This is perfect, better than factory specification, better than I could have machined it myself. He looked up at Greta with something like awe. I've never seen threading this precise outside of her precision instruments factory. She wiped her hands on her apron. The hardest part was the heat treatment. The steel needs to be hard enough to resist wear, but not so hard it becomes brittle. I had to anneal it, machine it, then reharden it using the forge in the back. The timing has to be exact. Too long and it gets too hard. Too short and it won't hold the threads under stress. You did all that in 4 hours? I've done it before. She gestured toward the racks of completed parts along the wall. Transmission components require precise heat treatment. I've developed a good sense for it.
Mueller held up the first screw, the one made to his exact specifications. This will work. I know it will work. May I test it? Please do. That's why I made 5 variations. Test them all. See which one performs best in actual use. We spent the next hour installing each screw in turn, testing the transmission response, feeling the difference in how the linkage engaged. Greta watched carefully, taking notes on which screw performed best, asking Mueller questions about the feel, the resistance, the engagement. The third screw, the one with slightly finer threading and harder steel, performed the best. The transmission response was immediate, crisp, with no lag at all. It was like the Tiger had been transformed into a different machine. "This is the one," Mueller said, his face split in a grin I hadn't seen in months. "This is perfect." Greta nodded, satisfied. "Good. Now I know which specifications work best. If you need more, I can make them faster now. How much do I owe you?" The official rate for custom machining is 50 pfennigs per piece. She held out her hand. 2 marks 50 for 5 screws. Mueller paid her from his pocket, counting out the coins carefully. He paused, holding them, looking at her. "If I put this in my report, if I tell them about this modification, every Tiger in the Wehrmacht could benefit. Thousands of tanks could be improved, lives could be saved." She shook her head firmly. "Please don't. If you tell them, they'll standardize it. They'll assign it to some factory in Essen that will mass produce it with cheaper steel and looser tolerances, and it won't work as well. They'll cut corners to save costs, rush production to meet quotas, and the quality will suffer. And they'll want to know who designed it, and then I'll spend my time in meetings with engineers and officers, explaining and defending and justifying, instead of making parts." She looked at the lathe, at the other components waiting to be machined, at the racks of work in progress that filled the factory. "I'd rather stay here and make things that actually work, things I can control, where I can guarantee the quality. If you standardize this and mass produce it, you'll save some lives, yes, but you'll also produce a lot of mediocre screws that almost work, that fail under stress, that cause new problems. I've seen it happen 100 times. Mueller nodded slowly, understanding. "What if I just quietly tell other crews, the ones I trust? Send them here to you if they want the modification?" She considered this. "That would be acceptable. I can't make hundreds of these, but I can make dozens. And if I train some of the other machinists here, show them the techniques, maybe we can make more. But quietly, one crew at a time. Word of mouth, not official channels." "Deal," Mueller said, and they shook hands. I saw something pass between them in that moment. 2 people who'd lost too much, but who refused to give up. 2 craftspeople who believed that doing good work still mattered, even in the midst of chaos. A kind of unspoken understanding that the small things, the individual screw, the single tank, the one life saved, were what actually mattered, not the grand strategies or the big picture. "Thank you," Mueller said quietly. "You've given us a chance we didn't have before." "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Thank me when you survive the war." We installed the optimal screws that afternoon. Mueller did it himself, carefully removing the old linkage screws and replacing them with Greta's perfectly machined components. The fit was so precise, he had to use a micrometer to verify they'd actually seated properly. Then he adjusted the linkage tension, checked the clearances, tested the movement by hand, and finally buttoned up the inspection plate. "Give it a try," he told me. I climbed into the driver's seat. The familiar smell of the Tiger's interior, diesel fuel, gun oil, stale sweat, the metallic tang of the radio equipment, settled around me like a well-worn coat. I'd spent hundreds of hours in this seat, learned every vibration and sound, every quirk and personality trait of this particular machine. I started the engine. The Maybach rumbled to life, 700 horsepower of German engineering that consumed fuel like a bonfire and broke down if you looked at it wrong. But it was my bonfire, my breakdown waiting to happen, and I knew every vibration and sound it made. I engaged the transmission and pushed the gear lever forward. The Tiger moved instantly. Not half a second later, not with the familiar lag that I'd learned to compensate for. Instantly. The moment I moved the lever, the transmission engaged and 63 tons of steel responded like it was reading my mind. I shifted through all 8 gears, forward and reverse, high and low. Every shift was immediate, precise, perfectly responsive. The difference was staggering. It was like the Tiger had been half asleep before, and now it was fully awake, responding to my inputs with almost telepathic speed. I reversed, spun the tank in a pivot turn, shifted forward, reversed again. Each movement was crisp, controlled, immediate. The transmission that had always felt like it was fighting me now felt like an extension of my own body. Mueller was standing outside, watching. When I climbed out, he was grinning like a child with a new toy. "Well," he asked, though he could see the answer on my face. "It's perfect," I said. "It's like the lag never existed. It's like driving what the Tiger should have been all along." "Good." He patted the Tiger's hull affectionately. "Because we're going to need every advantage we can get." He was right about that. We both knew it. The Soviets were coming, and no amount of German engineering was going to stop them forever. But maybe, just maybe, Greta's screws would keep us alive long enough to see the end of the war. We stayed at the factory a while longer. Mueller wanted to make some other minor adjustments while we had access to proper tools and skilled workers. Greta showed him some modifications to the cooling system that might help with the Tiger's chronic overheating problems. She had ideas about everything, little improvements born from years of experience and careful observation. Before we left, I found her back at her lathe, already working on another component for another tank. She didn't look up when I approached, but she knew I was there. "Thank you," I said. "Don't thank me," she replied, not taking her eyes off her work. "Just survive. That's thanks enough. I'll try." "Good." She made a minute adjustment to her cutting tool. "And if you do survive, remember this. Remember that there are people like me, people you'll never hear about, making the pieces that keep the machine running. We're not heroes, we're just trying to do good work. But the work matters." "I'll remember," I promised. I kept that promise. I'm keeping it now, telling you this story. On September 23rd, 3 days after Greta made her screws, the Soviets launched a major offensive across the Vistula. It wasn't the final push, not yet, but it was big. 3 rifle divisions, 2 tank brigades, artillery support that turned the morning sky black with smoke. Our orders were to hold the village of Wola, a nothing place that mattered only because it sat on a crossroads. 16 Tigers, 9 of them operational, against over 100 T-34s and an unknown number of infantry. The math wasn't in our favor. We took up position in the village ruins, holed down behind rubble piles, waiting for the Soviet armor to come into range. The morning was cold, the sky low and gray with cloud, the kind of day that makes you feel like the sun has abandoned the world and isn't coming back. I could see them advancing across the open fields, dark shapes through the smoke, coming in waves like the tide. T-34s and T-34-85s, the workhorses of the Soviet tank force. Not as heavily armored as the Tiger, not as well gunned, but there were so many of them. For every Tiger we had, they had a dozen tanks. And behind the tanks, waves of infantry, tiny figures running through the smoke. Vogel's voice crackled over the intercom. "Targets 800 meters. Schaefer, you see him?" "Jawohl," Werner replied. his eye pressed to the gunner's sight. I count 12 T-34s in the first wave, more behind them. Wait for my mark. Let them close to 600. We waited. Otto was breathing hard in the loader's position, and I could hear him muttering prayers under his breath. Gefreiter Otto Becker, 19 years old, who should have been at university studying engineering instead of loading 88mm shells into a gun that would kill men he'd never met. 600 meters, Werner called. I have the lead tank. Fire. The 88mm gun barked, the whole Tiger rocking with the recoil, and the lead T-34 exploded in a gout of flame. I'd seen it happen dozens of times before, but it never stopped being horrifying. Target destroyed, Werner reported calmly, shifting to second tank. Loading, Otto shouted, ramming another shell home. Fire when ready, Vogel ordered. Another shot. Another T-34, brewing up, black smoke pouring from its hatches. The Soviet tanks spread out, trying to flank us, and that's when the difference became obvious. A T-34 swung wide to our left, trying to get around our position. Before Greta's modification, I would have anticipated the move, started my shift early, compensated for the lag. Now I just moved, saw the threat, pushed the lever, and the Tiger responded instantly. We pivoted left, presenting our frontal armor, and Werner put a shell through the T-34 side before it could fire. Other Tigers were still compensating for the lag, still anticipating their shifts, working around the limitation that they'd lived with for months. They were slower. Not much, maybe a second or two. But in tank combat, a second or two is the difference between living and dying. Tiger 219, commanded by Lieutenant Krauss, got caught in a flanking maneuver. By the time his driver compensated for the transmission lag and reversed out of position, a T-34 had put 2 rounds into his side armor. The Tiger didn't brew up. Tigers almost never did. Their armor was too thick. But it was knocked out, immobilized, and Krauss and his crew had to abandon it under fire. 3 of them.
Over the next 2 weeks, Mueller quietly spread the word. He told other company mechanics about Greta's modification. He gave them the dimensions, the specifications, the exact tolerances needed. He showed them the screws, let them examine the threading, explained how to install them properly. Some of the mechanics tried to make the parts themselves. Most of them couldn't match Greta's precision. The tolerances were just too tight, required too much skill and too much experience. A few managed to produce screws that were close enough to work, screws that reduced the lag if not eliminated entirely. But most of the mechanics who wanted the modification ended up making the trip to Poznan themselves, finding Greta at her lathe, asking politely if she could spare the time to make another set. She always said yes. She would set aside whatever she was working on, listen to the mechanic explain what they needed, and then make a new set of screws. Sometimes she would modify the specification slightly based on what she'd learned from previous installations. She kept notes, a worn notebook filled with measurements and observations, constantly refining her design. By early October, about a third of the operational Tigers in Schwer Panzerabteilung 503 had been modified. You could tell which ones they were by watching them maneuver. They were faster, more responsive, better able to exploit tactical opportunities and escape dangerous situations. Word spread beyond our battalion. Crews from other units heard about the modification and made the trip to Poznan. Greta trained 2 other machinists in the factory to help with the work, showing them her techniques, her heat treatment process, her methods for achieving the tight tolerances. But she insisted on personally inspecting every screw before it left the factory, checking the threading with her gauges, ensuring that each piece met her standards. The Tigers with the modification had a survival rate approximately 40% higher than unmodified tanks. I know this because after the war, a military historian named Dr. Hans Weber tracked down surviving members of our unit and compiled statistics. He spent years on this research, interviewing veterans, examining maintenance records, analyzing combat reports. He calculated that over the course of the autumn 1944 defensive operations, the improved transmission response prevented an estimated 73 Tiger losses that would otherwise have occurred. Each Tiger that survived because of the modification lived to fight another day, destroyed more enemy tanks, held defensive positions longer.
Each Tiger had a crew of 5 men. That's 365 lives saved directly by Greta's modification. But it goes deeper than that. Each Tiger that survived could continue fighting, could destroy more Soviet tanks, could hold defensive positions longer. Each position held meant fewer Soviet breakthroughs, fewer encirclements, fewer units cut off and destroyed. Dr. Weber's analysis, published in 1978, estimated that the modification indirectly saved approximately 2,100 German soldiers by improving defensive capabilities and preventing Soviet breakthrough operations during the retreat from Poland. 2,100 soldiers, men with families, with mothers and fathers and wives and children and futures, all because a woman in a factory in Poznan spent 4 hours making a set of screws that should have cost 50 pfennigs each. When Dr. Weber published his findings, there was some controversy. Some historians argued his numbers were inflated, that he couldn't possibly calculate indirect effects with that kind of precision. Others said he was understating the impact, that the modification had ripple effects he hadn't accounted for. But I was there. I saw what those screws did. I saw Tiger 231 respond instantly when other tanks lagged. I saw crews survive because they could reposition half a second faster. I saw the difference between a good idea and perfect execution, between competent work and masterful craftsmanship. The screws saved lives. Maybe 2,100, maybe more, maybe less. The exact number doesn't matter. What matters is that Greta Hoffmann refused to accept mediocrity, refused to cut corners, refused to say good enough when she could do better. And because she held herself to that standard, hundreds of men lived who would have died. I never saw Greta Hoffmann again after that day in September. The war kept moving, kept grinding forward, and we kept retreating. October brought heavier fighting as the Soviets pushed deeper into Poland. November brought snow and ice and desperate defensive actions. December brought the knowledge that we were losing, that no amount of courage or skill or perfect engineering was going to change the outcome. By January 1945, we'd been pushed back into Germany itself. The Vistula line had collapsed, and we were fighting on German soil, defending towns where we'd grown up, where our families lived. The Eastern Front had become a chaotic nightmare of retreating units, refugees flooding west ahead of the Soviet advance, and desperate last stands that accomplished nothing except to buy a few more hours. Tiger 231 survived until March. We'd fought through Poland, through East Prussia, all the way back to the Oder River. The tank that had carried us through 6 months of combat, that had saved us countless times with its improved transmission response, finally met its end during a Soviet artillery barrage. We weren't even in combat. We were repositioned in a forest waiting for orders when the shells started falling. Random harassment fire, the kind that happened constantly during those last months. A 152mm shell landed directly on our hull, penetrating the top armor, always the thinnest, always the vulnerable point. Otto died instantly. He never knew what hit him. Just 19 years old, killed by random chance, by a shell fired by someone who never saw us, never knew they'd hit anything. Werner died a few minutes later, his chest crushed by a piece of shrapnel. He was conscious long enough to ask me to write to his wife, to tell her he'd thought about her at the end. I promised him I would, and I kept that promise. Vogel, Mueller, and I survived with injuries. Vogel lost an eye. Mueller's left arm was shattered and had to be amputated at the elbow. I took shrapnel in my right leg that left me with a permanent limp. But we lived. We crawled out of the burning Tiger and into the forest while the artillery kept falling, and somehow we made it back to friendly lines. I was reassigned to a different unit after I healed enough to walk. A different tank, a different crew, men I didn't know as well. The war stumbled toward its end through April, and then, finally, mercifully, it was over. VE Day, May 8, 1945. The announcement came over the radio, and we just stood there in the ruins of Berlin, not celebrating, not crying, just standing there in exhausted silence. It was over. We'd lost, and we were alive. I went home to Hamburg in June after they released us from the temporary holding camps. Hamburg had been bombed flat, a landscape of rubble and burned-out buildings that barely resembled the city I remembered. But my family's apartment building was still standing, miraculously intact, and my parents were alive. My father looked 10 years older than when I'd left. My mother cried when she saw me limp through the door. My younger sister, who'd been 14 when I'd gone to war, was 17 now, and looked at me with the wary eyes of someone who'd seen too much too young. We were all damaged, all haunted, all trying to figure out how to live in a world that had been broken and badly repaired. I married Anna Weber in 1947. We'd known each other before the war. She'd lived 3 buildings down, and I'd kissed her once at a dance in 1943, a week before I shipped out. She'd waited, though I'd never asked her to, never promised her anything. She'd waited through the war and through the chaos afterward, and when I came home, she was still there. We had 3 children, Thomas, born in 1948, Greta, born in 1951, and named for someone I never forgot, and Elizabeth, born in 1954. I worked in my father-in-law's machine shop, using the skills I'd learned in the Army and before the war, making parts for the rebuilding effort. Germany needed everything: machine tools, vehicle parts, construction equipment. There was plenty of work for a skilled machinist. I was good at my job. After all, I'd learned from the best. I'd watched Greta Hoffmann work, seen her absolute precision, her refusal to accept anything less than perfection. I tried to bring that same standard to my own work. Every part I made, I measured 3 times, checked the tolerances, verified the finish. Every thread I cut, I tested with gauges, ensuring that each piece met her standards. I never told Anna the full story of the war. She knew I'd been a tank driver, knew I'd been wounded, knew I'd lost friends. But I didn't tell her about the fear, about watching Otto and Werner die, about the sound of men screaming in burning tanks. I didn't tell her about the nights I woke up sweating, hearing phantom shell impacts, smelling diesel fuel and blood. But I did tell her about Greta Hoffmann, about the woman in Poznan who'd made perfect screws because she believed good work mattered, about how those screws had saved lives, including mine. Anna listened, and she understood why our daughter's name was Greta. For years, that's how things were: work, family, the slow rebuilding of a normal life. I didn't think much about the war, tried not to remember the bad parts, focused on the present and the future. Germany was rising out of the ruins, the economy was growing, life was getting better. We were lucky to be alive, and we tried to live accordingly. But then, in 1978, Dr. Hans Weber published his analysis. The book was called Engineering and Survival: Minor Modifications and Their Impact on German Armored Vehicle Combat Effectiveness 1944 to 1945. Not exactly a bestseller title, but it was thoroughly researched, extensively documented, and it included a full chapter on Greta's transmission modification. Dr. Weber.
One of them was Josef Hartmann, the younger brother of the driver who died in Tiger 217, the death that had motivated Mueller to seek out a solution. Josef had joined the army after his brother's death, had served in a different panzer unit, and had survived the war. When he read about Greta's modification, he broke down crying. "If only they'd had those screws 3 days earlier," he said when we met. "My brother would have survived. He would have been able to reverse out of that ambush. He'd be alive." I didn't know what to say to that. The arbitrary nature of survival, the way a few days made all the difference between life and death. It wasn't fair. It wasn't justice. It was just chance, just timing, just the random chaos that determined who lived and who died. But Josef understood. "I'm not angry," he said. "I'm grateful. Grateful that at least some men survived because someone cared enough to do excellent work. My brother's death mattered because it led to the solution. That has to mean something." Another veteran, Carl Becker, no relation to Otto, told me about how his Tiger had been modified in October 1944. "We called it the Hoffmann modification," he said. Word spread among the crews. Everyone wanted it. The mechanics who could make the screws themselves became valuable, and the ones who couldn't would trade anything, cigarettes, rations, even fuel allocations, to get someone to make them a set. He pulled out a small cloth pouch from his pocket, opened it carefully. Inside were 5 screws, worn but still intact, each one precisely threaded.
"I kept them," he said. "After my Tiger was destroyed, I went back to the wreck when things calmed down and removed the screws. I've carried them ever since. They saved my life, and I want to remember that. I want to remember that in the middle of all that horror, someone cared about doing good work." I understood. I'd kept pieces of Tiger 231 myself, a fragment of the damaged hull, a piece of the transmission linkage. Physical reminders that the war had been real, that the people who died and the people who'd survived had all been real, that it mattered. In 1982, a group of us, veterans whose lives had been saved by the modification, pooled our money and commissioned a memorial. Not a big one, not a monument to war or victory or any of the usual things. Just a simple plaque in the Stuttgart Machine Workers Union Hall, where Greta's father had once been a member. The plaque reads, "In memory of Greta Hoffmann, machinist, craftsman, human being, who believed that every screw matters, and saved 2,100 lives through the perfection of her work. 1903 to 1945 ? We remember." The question mark after 1945 was my idea. Because we don't know. We don't know when she died or if she died or what happened to her. But we want to remember her anyway, want to mark that she existed, that her work mattered, that she made a difference. The dedication ceremony was small, maybe 30 people, mostly veterans and their families. My daughter Greta came with me, carrying her own daughter, my granddaughter, also named Greta. 3 generations of Greta, linked across time by a story about screws and survival. I gave a short speech, talked about watching Greta work, about her precision and her grief and her insistence on doing things right. I talked about how she'd lost her husband and son, but kept working, kept caring, kept believing that good work mattered. I talked about how those screws had kept me alive long enough to come home, to marry Anna, to have children and grandchildren, to live a full life. "I don't know if Greta Hoffmann survived the war," I said. "I hope she did. I hope she had children and grandchildren. I hope she lived to see Germany rebuilt. I hope she had a long and peaceful life. But even if she didn't, even if she died in those final months of chaos, her work lives on. Every person here, every child and grandchild, exists because she refused to accept mediocrity." My daughter stood next to me, tears running down her face, holding her own daughter tight. 3 generations that exist because of 50 pfennigs worth of steel, shaped with absolute precision by hands that understood craftsmanship. After the ceremony, an old woman approached me. She must have been in her 80s, bent with age, but her eyes were sharp and clear. "I knew Greta," she said. "We worked together in Poznan. I was one of the machinists she trained." My heart stopped. "You knew her? What happened to her?" The old woman, her name was Marguerite Fischer, nodded slowly. "We were evacuated together in January 1945. The transport was attacked by Soviet aircraft near the Oder River. The train was strafed and many people were killed. I was injured, lost consciousness. When I woke up in a field hospital 3 days later, I tried to find out what happened to everyone from our transport." She paused, and I could see her struggling with the memory. Greta was listed as missing, presumed dead. But there was no body, no confirmation. In the chaos, many records were lost or never made. She could have survived and ended up somewhere else, or she could have died and been buried in an unmarked grave. I don't know. "Did she know?" I asked. "Did she know that her modification was saving lives?" Marguerite smiled, and it was a sad smile, full of memory and loss. She knew. By December, word had spread. Crews would come to the factory and tell us about battles they'd survived because of the improved transmission response. Greta never took credit, never boasted about it. But I could see it in her eyes. She knew her work mattered. And it gave her peace, I think. A reason to keep going when everything else had been taken from her. She reached into her bag and pulled out a worn notebook, the pages yellowed with age. This is hers, her work journal. She gave it to me the night before the evacuation, told me to keep it safe, that maybe someday someone would want to know how she did it. She handed it to me and I opened it with trembling hands. Pages filled with measurements, sketches, calculations, notes about thread pitch and heat treatment and material properties, the accumulated knowledge of a master craftsman recorded in careful handwriting. On the last page, dated January 14, 1945, was a final entry. Tomorrow we evacuate. I don't know what will happen, but I know this: every screw I made mattered. Every perfect thread, every precise measurement, every hour of careful work. I kept someone's son alive, maybe many someones. That has to mean something. If I die tomorrow, let this work be my legacy. Not the war, not the loss, not the grief. The work. The belief that excellence matters, even in the midst of chaos, especially in the midst of chaos. I couldn't speak. I just stood there, holding her notebook, reading her final words, and crying like I hadn't cried since the war ended. I'm 79 years old now, 80 next month if I make it. My hands shake sometimes, arthritis from decades of machining work. My hearing is mostly gone from too many hours inside a Tiger with the 88 firing. I wake up sometimes with phantom pain in my leg, the one that was shredded by shrapnel, and I'm confused for a moment about why it hurts. My wife Anna died 3 years ago. 52 years of marriage, 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and she was the best thing that ever happened to me. She understood why I needed to tell this story, why I needed to remember, why I spent hours in my workshop making perfect screws that nobody needed. My daughter Greta runs her own machine shop now, trained by me just like Greta Hoffmann was trained by her father. She's excellent at her work, meticulous and precise, and she understands that every piece matters. She's teaching her daughter, my granddaughter, the third Greta, the same lessons. The same attention to detail, the same refusal to accept good enough when she can do better, the same belief that craftsmanship matters. I have a machine shop in my garage, just a hobby now, a way to keep my hands busy and my mind occupied. I have a small lathe, nothing fancy, but well maintained. And sometimes I make things, little metal pieces, screws and bolts and parts that no one needs. I make them to exacting tolerances, measuring 3 times, checking the thread pitch, getting it perfect. And every time I make a screw, I think about Greta Hoffmann. I think about her at her lathe, her hands steady and sure, shaping steel into something perfect. I think about her saying, "Every screw matters," and meaning it, really meaning it, with the weight of her husband and son and everything she'd lost behind those words. I think about her refusing to cut corners, refusing to accept mediocrity, insisting on excellence even when the world was falling apart around her. I understood. I'd kept pieces of Tiger 231 myself, a fragment of the damaged hull, a piece of the transmission linkage. Physical reminders that the war had been real, that the people who died and the people who'd survived had all been real, that it mattered. In 1982, a group of us, veterans whose lives had been saved by the modification, pooled our money and commissioned a memorial. Not a big one, not a monument to war or victory or any of the usual things. Just a simple plaque in the Stuttgart Machine Workers Union Hall, where Greta's father had once been a member. The plaque reads, "In memory of Greta Hoffmann, machinist, craftsman, human being, who believed that every screw matters, and saved 2,100 lives through the perfection of her work. 1903 to 1945 question."